All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter your time zone. Today, three issues. We look at HTTP, we look at some of the WinForms stuff, and then we spend the rest of the time looking at some of the attributes we want to do for our static analyzer for OS-specific functionality. So let's start with the HTTP one, because I think that is probably the fastest one. Famous last words. And then let me... Corey, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so we approved this API previously, and then we got some more data from some experts in the field saying, hey, this will actually be really bad for gRPC. We need this extra feature. So we added this keep alive ping policy property. Essentially, it controls if we send keep alive pings when there are no active requests on an HTTP2 connection. gRPC has this weird behavior where most servers come default configured. If you ping them and you have no active request, they just shut the connection down on you. So we want to avoid that.
So we're just looking at one property, one enum since the last review.
Yes, just the keep alive ping policy and that enum. It could be a bool, but we could also leave it open for future behavior.
So what's the default?
The default would be with active requests.
And is that what anything other than gRPC wants?
I suspect very few people actually care about this. Everything else should be okay with always. But I figure if gRPC is doing it, we don't know what else is doing that.
Because, I mean, what does it mean?
So the feature has one serious use case, which is if you have an outstanding request that's like long pulling a server and the server just doesn't have any data to send you, we want to keep the connection alive. So that's the gRPC use case. And the other ones are more like just happy coincidences of detecting broken connections and preventing broken connections. So having it with only or with active requests, essentially it means that if there are no active requests and there's just an idle connection sitting in our connection pool, it may be killed by a firewall or some other thing.
But this is, I guess, active in this notion means some other request being processed by the same socket's HTTP handler?
It means for a specific connection, there has to be an outstanding request on that connection.
Right, but it's not from the universe at large. It's contained within this object and possibly a subcontainer of this object.
Exactly.
Because
it's basically impossible for someone to reason about if there is an active request because we split it up into pools with a lot of small weird logic, but generally people are using the same pool for most use cases.
Right, because the previous suggestion of the purpose of the feature was to, if you have a long request, so I guess this would still be true. It's if you have a long request, it'll ping it, but then what would the case be where you're pinging it that you don't have a request? Like when is the always going to be different than the with active requests?
So you've made a request and now you have a connection being used for that request. The request completes we don't close the connection immediately. We pool it. Possibly indefinitely, possibly based on some lifetime configuration. But we pool it, and always would be sending pings in that case. When there are no requests on the connections, it's just sitting there idle.
Okay.
Essentially, it's just trying to keep the connection alive.
Well, that then. So, what does WinHTTP handler do? Since you're not adding the option here, because you added the keep alive pings for WinHTTP handler and sockets handler both, I think.
Honestly, don't know what WinHTTP does.
Because if it only does with active requests, then I would not add this and would only implement with active requests, because the notion that I stop talking to a thing and you're going to keep pinging it forever actually feels wrong. So with active requests sounds like the only right behavior.
No, we have other settings to control the lifetime of a connection when it's idle. So that would control the lifetime. This would just say, as long as you're alive, as long as the user asked you to be alive, we're going to try to keep you alive.
Fair enough. Yeah, so I guess I'll stick with my statement of, if WinHTTP handler is doing the thing that makes gRPC happy with active requests, and you don't have anyone actually asking for always, then don't do this.
We could certainly be conservative and say, just leave this out, have it always be when active, and then revisit this at a later time if someone else asks for it.
Well, you had mentioned that this is simply a request, right? It isn't like it's okay if the underlying layer doesn't honor always, even if it's set, correct?
No, we would always honor it.
Really? Like even if you're on a mobile device?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine that if you're on a mobile or battery operated device, like the OS itself will prohibit you from having an always like policy because you'll be tombstoned.
They're the ones pulsing the socket. It never thought it was idle.
Yeah, but I remember like we discussed stuff like this way back when and decided that it was a bad idea for the operating system at large to support it because it would encourage applications to drain battery.
So if you're talking about like a Xamarin scenario, they actually don't even use sockets HTTP handler. We've got plugins into the OS APIs that do that sort of stuff for us.
Okay, great. But coming back to my other question then, so because sockets HTTP handler is by definition implemented fully in managed code, you can control when the timer pulses.
Exactly. I should also note that gRPC, which this request primarily came from, all of the gRPC clients allow this policy to be configured.
Okay.
I asked for data on when someone would want to configure it one way or another. I did not hear any responses, but all I know is they all allow it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you need the feature, it seems reasonable. I would stick with the enum because, as the comment says, you may end up with more in the future. But if you don't actually have a need for the always policy, then removing complexity is always good.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of adding it later, but I mean, Corey made a compelling point. Everybody else does it, but when he said that, I heard my mom that said, if everybody else jumps off the bridge, do you also jump off the bridge? But like, I mean,
well, if everybody else has the policy, but no one ever picks always.
yeah, it seems like a bit of a.
Yeah, because someone would have to opt into this, which is where I'm drawing the question mark.
Yeah. I suppose the primary enabler for this would be to make it so that the .NET gRPC client had all the features of all the other platform clients for it.
Well, simplicity is a feature too.
True.
So, because I think the shape is reasonable if the feature is needed. I just question if the feature is needed.
Yeah.
Yeah. the initial proposal that came to you left this out because I did not see that the feature was needed either. And then I got some data saying that the default option we chose was wrong and the feature was needed. I'm assuming that there's more data out there hiding from me saying why this is actually useful.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's compelling reason why somebody would want to configure always, I mean, as Jeremy said, the API looks very reasonable. It's just, it seems yet another way where people can screw themselves. Because I think if you don't know anything, always seems probably more likely what people would pick if they would configure it manually than with active requests.
And it feels like that's really just you're just hurting whatever NATs you're trying to keep open, because, by definition, if you need the always policy, you're keeping the connection alive when you don't need to, and you're probably going to ping several times before you realize you were never going to need it again. So yes, you're maybe saving another TCP handshake on the resumption if things got closed out from under you, but it feels like a bad policy to expose. Unless you have some weird, no, because if you had a weird control plane thing where you're just waiting on a callback forever, that's the definition of an active request. So
yeah, the only thing I could imagine is like diagnosing issues, right? When something weird happened on the server and the connection just died underneath you or something, but like...
Yeah, but the NAT can die at any point anyway. Like this is the network. Everything can go wrong at every step at any time.
Fair enough.
Mainly, I would say that we have lifetime configuration elsewhere. We can trust our users to set that appropriately for their scenario. Maybe.
I mean, the difference is, like with this one, this is taking it from, they have a lifetime management policy that controls the resource consumption on this system to they're now setting a property that they probably don't understand that's resource consumption on a shared resource that's some other system. Whether it's a NAT or a firewall or whatever, like you're increasing somebody's state table by doing these pings, or rather you're preventing them from compacting their state table. And
True.
So it feels like, yeah, unless there's a compelling reason to have this, I would recommend not having it. The always policy. And then once we're down to an enum with one member, we don't need to expose it.
Okay, so my opinion is that I would be fine with that. I'm just I really hope that I'm not back in 2 weeks saying we do need this because I finally got more data from James.
Totally fine. I mean, like if that is the case, I mean, we can. I think we already kind of approved the API as the API shape. It's just, do we need the feature? And so I think that will be very quick. Just flip it back to approved rather than close.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, then let me move the blocking marker and close it.
Well, there was other API on there that was approved.
Oh.
Yeah, we need that to stay open.
Oh, you edited the existing thing?
I see.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. All right.
Yeah, don't do that.
Then
do it. It confuses Emo's tool.
Well, I think I handled this correctly now. But like we will find out in the notes what this thing now is. All right, so then let me actually edit the proposal.
I was only testing your tool, Emo, that's all.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the notes are shitty. I'll blame Corey. Da-dum. This is funny. All right. So now it's closed, reopened, approved, or whatever that translates to.
Sounds right.
All right, then Jeremy, you're up.
So, WinForms has got a text renderer to draw text, and it's of course the way to specifically draw text directly, as opposed to setting titles and button text and that sort of thing. So we don't have any way to get in here with spans. So the basic proposal here is to provide the span overloads, so that you can do this without allocating a ton. For custom controls and things like that, that's actually pretty useful. It's really the main spot that we have that you could come in with strings that you might actually really have value in passing a span.
I mean, this seems pretty straightforward. You're just spanifying existing string overloads, right?
Yeah. The only caveat here is that the old behavior would allow you to mutate the string.
Yeah.
So we're stepping away from that, and that's called out in here. It was with a very specific set of flags. If you ask for ellipses, you can actually pass another flag that says, go ahead and munge my string, to make the string represent what it actually gets displayed at as.
Sorry, can you explain what you mean by that? Like, does it, like in the text format flags, there is a modifier or something there?
Yeah, so there's in the text format flags, there are options to specify that you want ellipses drawn, so you want the system to cut the thing down to fit. There's two different versions of that.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And then there's an additional flag that says, hey, take my input string and modify it to be whatever I actually displayed. So it'll cut it down.
That's not scary.
Yeah, so removing it, and I had a comment down there, is we basically want to come back around with another proposal about how people can do that specifically if they need to.
I mean, it wouldn't mutate the string, right? It would just render something else than what you passed in, right?
No, it mutates the string.
Seriously?
Yep.
So you call it with an instance of a string that is like length 15, and then it comes back with length 4?
Well, it has an embedded null. Because the mutated strings are always smaller. And you can see there's a link down there where somebody had opened a bug on us because string.copy got depreciated. And they were utilizing it to modify.
Okay, that is...
That's the 1564 link. So that
this one here.
Tobias put in there.
So rather than introduce another 15 overloads later, is it worth trying to find a way to return a new string from these APIs?
I wouldn't be doing 15. It would just be, because it's such a corner case, we'd only do the 4 unique ones, right? We can't collapse them because the defaults are actually not constants for the things. So like the defaults for the color happens to be color empty, which is actually a special color that has no initialized state, weird stuff like that. But you can see this person's code that they did that they would call measure text, look for the embedded null, and then copy the substring out. So
yeah, that design is not great.
No.
So it would only be the ones that are taking text format flags, right? That's the 4 you mean, right? And it would only be draw text with text format flags, but measure text wouldn't do anything, right?
Oh, measure text does the same thing.
Oh, measure text also matches the string.
So
if you pass a flag to it.
Yeah, they both go, which he's doing. He's calling measure text here, actually. So it's both of them. So The only difference with measure text, they both go to the same API. Measure text just adds another flag that says, don't actually draw it, just give me the measurements.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
So, the current plan of record is just to block that completely and then come up with another more holistic API for that. It seems over complicated to do it. It just needs more thought, right, as to how we would, allow you to pass a buffer in and how that would fit within the other stuff. So, and I might put a compatibility flag in that people can do that on the original ones. But these new overloads, I definitely will not allow it. The modify string, because that can catch you off guard, right?
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, because that could be coming from like the static portion of the loaded image, and modifying it would actually AV.
Can we kill this behavior entirely in WinForms?
That's what I'm saying I'm going to do, and I'll find some other solution to it. But and if somebody's blocked by it, I'll provide some flag for it that they can turn it on for the old APIs, right? The existing ones.
Yeah, APIs that modify string instance are, that is terrible. That should not be the case.
Yeah, well, it caught me off guard. I didn't feel really good when I found it either. Like I had to take a break.
And a shower, probably. Yeah, no, that's not great.
So it's related to this thing, and I don't think that we need to go into trying to find a solution for a new API for that. I just wanted to call it out that was something that's another API behavior change in this that prefer to do, because it's dangerous on many levels, right? And particularly with all the other potential features that can come in.
Yeah, it seems like the way you would model this, though, you would basically say there's a brand new API, like similar to draw text, measure text, and then I don't know, constrain text or something, right? Where you basically pass in the same overloads that you have for measure text, and that will just give you back a new string, and then you may have another overload that does it with spans rather than with string, and then everything else you would just pass to draw text or measure text directly, and it would just say this enum member either is gone or just doesn't work anymore.
Or one of the things we could do is actually have a final argument that we add on to each of the four things that
gives you back the new string.
Has the actual output string.
If you actually cared, that's the other thing. We could maybe just change the method bodies to just compute the new string inline and then just render that and then throw it away, basically.
Well, internally it'll render the right thing. It's just like whether you set that flag or not, or whether or not Windows actually. So it'll still render exactly the right way. The question is what it does to the input.
Oh, so modify string isn't just controlling what is rendered on the screen. I thought it modifies the string, renders the string, and if you don't modify string, then you don't get the ellipsis. But you're saying you can say, give me the ellipsis and not modify my string, in which case it still renders fine.
Yep.
Well, yeah, that seems like modify string is really bad.
Well, from the purposes of our API, sure. And if you're using it internally, you would know, well, I'm not going to pass a const.
Right. Well, you say that, but
So anyway,
fair enough.
The plan is to kill that and then have some more deep thought about exactly what the shape of that other API is and beat it around a little bit before we bring that additional thing that does something with modify string.
But then my question is are you then confident that you really need the overloads for a span, or would you do it differently?
No, I would keep them there because it makes it's easy for people to transition their code.
Yeah, the internal implementation also just spanifies a string and then works on the span. So
yep. Which is why I brought this up. Is I've been going through paint allocations for paint messages, and I've refactored a bunch of stuff, and I went through this one, and I'm like, hey, well, this actually doesn't do anything other than this other magic thing that comes behind it. It's all span.
Okay, so the APIs currently are not assuming null terminated strings; they're passing in length terminated.
Yep. Which is why, and I call that out up at the top there, is it's because it's unusual, a lot of the Win32 APIs are null terminated, but this one in particular And I think it's partially because of the modify thing, but they actually have you pass in the length of the input string. So which is great, because then we can actually, this really means something in this case, right? You're not actually having to make some extra buffer step, to intermediate buffer step.
So
and
what
the
sorry, what is with graphics? Like, that also has draw text and render text, or is it basically deprecated in favor of text renderer?
Text renderer goes to the HDC directly, and that's why it takes iDevice context. So this was added later for performance. And now that we can take, the last thing I came back with was actually adding iDevice context to paint event args.
Right.
So if you get a paint message, you'll get a paint event args, and if you go back and you throw that thing back into these methods, particularly with the spans, like you get down to, which I said down there, it's like the allocations compared to what we did on framework are like less than 15% of what they used to be.
Right. Like, no, I'm just asking, like, the graphics class, where you have draw image, draw ellipsis, draw curve, all of
that's
that.
all GDI plus.
And we don't care there, I suppose, then.
No, because no matter what you do there, it's slow.
Yeah.
And allocates a ton, which, they, for a quick little historical thing, I mean, WinForms was written as a sort of a joint bet with GDI plus. And that's where the system drawing stuff is all around, but the performance is many orders of magnitude slower.
But it's plus
than GDI. As one concrete example, because I've been working on caching and everything for the GDI plus things, to create a pen and dispose of it in system drawing, which is mostly inside the native code, that takes in the tune of about 4 microseconds. And to do the same thing with a GDI pen, it takes about 8 nanoseconds. For those of you playing at home, that's 8 to 4,000. It's pretty substantial.
But then again, an Electron app takes 4 minutes to render a rectangle, so
well, that's the stuff I'm trying to fix up here. It's like we were allocating like crazy, and we allocate a ton less, for Bible.
All right,
and this fits in that whole bucket.
So, any objections then to approving the API as is?
No, looks good to me.
All right. Jeremy's silent.
Yeah. No, I like it.
No, I mean the other Jeremy.
He gave a thumbs up.
Okay. I
had a mouthful of crackers.
Actually, no. We only want the new ones, not the old ones. Not that it makes a huge difference, but I just have the API.
And so with the modify existing string flag, are you gonna mark that obsolete in this release?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right.
We won't allow it in on the other one.
All right, so let me just close this one then. All right, so my favorite topic. Hopefully we don't need the 1.5 hours for this, but it depends on how controversial it ends up being. So we added a new feature in this release, which we use to annotate platform-specific APIs. And this feature was heavily inspired by how the Android and iOS bindings work, where the idea is we have one SDK that is accumulative over time. So it is important for us to indicate on the API which version of the platform introduced the API, so that when you say I want to run on iOS 11, then we can give you warnings if you're calling APIs that were introduced in iOS 12, unless you have guarded those calls. That's fine. That works great for APIs that are truly platform specific, like for example, iOS bindings, Android bindings, or the Windows registry. Then later on, we talked about how we would support Blazor, where Blazor's challenge is that it runs inside the browser sandbox, and you can't access many of the features that you can virtually access anywhere else, like the file system, threading APIs, that sort of thing. So we could, of course, mark those APIs with being platform specific for every platform except for Blazor. So basically, we would exclude by marking the API as platform specific and then not exposing the ones that are unsupported. But that's very fragile over time and doesn't work very well. It also now means that everybody who calls these APIs is now responsible for guarding the calls for all the other platforms that have those APIs, which is also not what we want. So long story short, we wanted a way to mark APIs directly as unsupported, where the idea is the API is generally considered universally applicable, except for the platforms that it is marked for as not being supported. So kind of an exclusion list rather than an inclusion list, if you will. As we designed the feature, it became very quickly clear that we don't really want to invent a new set of attributes for that, because they would have the exact same semantics, except it would be, one minus or exclusion rather than. Basically, you would build a deny list, not an allow list, right? But we want the same semantics when it comes to versioning ranges and that sort of stuff. So what we basically said is like, let's rename the minimum OS platform attribute to a supported platform attribute, and then we moved in with unsupported. And what that basically does is we have basically a uniform way to annotate APIs. So basically, an API that would be marked as unsupported by Windows would look like this in .NET 5. And then let's say in .NET 6 we change the implementation of the API that we can actually make it work on Windows, but only on a specific version of Windows 10 and higher. So what we would do then is we would still leave it unsupported OS platform Windows and then add a new attribute that says, well, it is supported on Windows 10 point blah. What this now means is that this API is considered supported everywhere, except on Windows it's only supported on 10.0.19.03, right? And then similar for the iOS and Android APIs, you would just start with supported rather than starting with unsupported. So this would basically mark an API that is supported on iOS and iPadOS, starting with version 12 or version 13 in case of iPadOS. It was obsoleted in version 13 and was removed in version 14. So they look very similar. The key difference here is that the lowest version starts with supported in rather than with unsupported. And what that basically means is that that our analyzer basically will look at an API, will group all the platform attributes by OS platform ID, and then looks at the lowest version number and what attribute that is. If these attributes are all supported in, that means the API is considered platform specific and it's only supported on the platforms that are listed. If the minimum version is unsupported everywhere, then the API is considered, generally speaking, universally supported, except for the platforms where we say otherwise. And if you have a mixture of both of them, where basically the minimum version is sometimes supported and sometimes unsupported, our analyzer will flag the definition of the API as being inconsistently attributed, because you didn't make up your mind whether you want to build an allow list or a deny list. That's basically the general idea. Does that make sense to people?
It does, yes.
It makes sense to me. I had a bit of trouble wrapping my head around reading the spec, but the examples made sense.
Yeah, the spec has seen like 6 iterations or something. So, yeah, basically this is the behavior that I just described.
The kind of the grouping and allow list, deny list thing is kind of, I found that a little bit difficult to parse. But
yeah, sorry for that. The idea is basically, I think the end result is intuitive, right? So like when you look at the API, it should be clear what it means. We just have to define it for the analyzer so that we have sound semantics.
Mm-hmm.
Good. It made sense to people who weren't in the meeting that designed it.
So this right here means it is supported on Windows 10 or greater.
Correct.
Okay.
Like generally supported always means this version and all subsequent versions, unless you have another attribute that says otherwise for a later version, right? So for example, we would also support the notion that we could say unsupported in Windows 11, right? So basically we can model pretty much anything an OS can do. They can, not starting with an API, they can add the API, they can remove the API, and then they can even reintroduce the API if they really wanted to, and they can do this infinite number of times. Not that we would ever do that, but it's nice that we can model reality if we have to.
So what if an API is supported on Mac OS Intel version, but not ARM version?
Yeah, that's something we can't model. We generally speaking don't have a model for differing by architecture. Like we can't differ API service by architecture. That would be in the fine print of the API. I mean, strictly speaking, if we really wanted to enable this, given that all these things take strings, we are in principle free to say -x86 or something and then make that scenario work. The problem with that kind of thing is that keep in mind that everybody who calls the API is now on the hook for guiding calls. So given that most class libraries are any CPU, that might mean a lot of noise.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty rare that operating systems gate a particular API on an architecture. At least from my experience from Windows has been that if an API exists on x64, it also exists on ARM64, with very few exceptions.
Right.
Right, and
that was different in the first ARM version, I think, but that was more ship date versus.
Yes.
And where they do differ, they're generally intrinsics explicitly called out, much like our own hardware intrinsics, or they just return false on or 0 or the correct default if you query for it on an unsupported platform.
In the second example on the screen here, where you have unsupported OS platform Windows and then supported OS platform Win 10, would that, if you remove the unsupported OS platform, if we were to say this is now supported as of Windows 10 1903, would we also remove the unsupported OS platform attribute, or would we keep it?
No, we would keep it, because if you target a lower version, so basically if you remove this line here, basically what you're saying is this is a Windows specific API, so it only works on Windows starting with 1903.
Okay.
Yeah, the middle example right now, by having the two attributes, says it works on Windows 10, 1903, and later, and all versions that we know about for Mac OS, all versions of all Linuxes, all the mobile devices, just that Windows is the only thing that is known to not work, and that is limited to versions prior to 1903.
Yeah, and the analyzer will essentially track information about what OSs you're assuming, what minimum version you're assuming, and you can narrow that down with runtime checks, or you can restrict that with attributes.
Awesome.
Yeah, so somebody in chat asks where the strings are defined.
It's right there on the screen.
But basically, they are basically the set of strings that we allow after the new TFM, right? So basically, you would say if you do file new WinForms app or file new WPF app with .NET 5, your TFM is not going to say netcore app 5.0. It will say net 5.0 -Windows. And then if you do file new console app or file new class library, or maybe not class library, but file new ASP.NET, then your TFM will be target framework net 5.0 without a dash, right? So that's the difference between you are for all operating systems, whether you are for one particular operating system. And so the strings are finite. The version numbers are the ones that we actually ship with the SDK, and the analyzer will generally ensure that the syntax of those strings is legal, but the analyzer doesn't actually care what the strings themselves are, because it doesn't. Right? It just matters that the string that you have in the project file agrees with the string that the API that you are calling. So generally speaking, you should know what that string is because you configured your project file.
Yeah, it doesn't actually matter that the versions are valid or not. It just matters that they're internally consistent.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so then I consider this approved then, unless somebody says otherwise.
Jeff had a comment on the bottom of this.
I had a comment as well about the namespace.
Right. So Jeff suggested param string, but that would make the attribute not CLS compliant. In case.
I also think we have explicit guidelines that says don't do that. If you have an attribute that is multicast, multi-applicable, you should not offer both choices. You should make up your mind. Either it's a single attribute instance and then you can pass multiple strings, or you just apply the attribute multiple times. And we went with multiple times because we need to support different operating systems to begin with, right? Yeah, so I would not do the params one. And then the runtime versioning one, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think the reason why we went with that one was because we went where target framework name is, or target framework attribute, whatever it's called. That is in runtime versioning. And so that's where we put it. But I guess it doesn't have to be.
I mean, my suggestion or my thought process was runtime information.isOS platform and OS platform the struct all exist in a namespace. These are like attributes that go with those APIs. So it kind of feels like they should be together.
Yeah, runtime versioning is generally for shit that the compiler generates. So you should never have to interact with that, versus these ones here you're generally expected to put on your own method, so you should. It's similar to the APIs, but you're expected to actually use them. So I think I agree with that reasoning. The only
I could see a split. We do have the other one. The other attribute, right, is target platform attribute.
But that's also the one that you never have to apply yourself, right? Because that's just part of the, the compiler generates it for you, or the, MS Build generates it for you, but like same thing.
That one I could see being next to target framework attribute.
Right.
Like, that sort of makes sense. But like these, like supported OS, we expect people to actually apply these to their APIs so they don't have to do the if checks inside of them, right?
Right. I would agree with that.
But do we think interrupt services is...
No, I hate that name.
Best place for these?
So we don't.
That's where runtime information is.
Yeah,
though,
that's
right?
unfortunately where we put this fucker, and so that's the one you have to call.
I mean, I guess there's a question of, is there a reasonable expectation that people will be painting these on methods in lieu of using the is checks?
Maybe, but even that I think is like usually we end up with a combination would be my guess.
I would think a combination as well, right? Like I would imagine I have one method that always gets called. I do my if checks there that call into private methods that then are just attributed. So I don't have to.
Because bear in mind, like applying the attribute to your method is equivalent to just wrapping your entire method body in a runtime check.
You're kind of forwarding it to your caller. So,
in that the analyzer will then ensure any calls to your method will have a runtime check.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's functionally a difference in that the attributes are not enforced at runtime.
Right, but yeah.
Yeah, the thing is that the other thing is, so there's kind of two kind of audiences, right? There's the Windows audience, and so the Windows audience basically will never ever have to write an if check because we don't have any APIs that are really, introduced after Win 7 at this point, right? So basically everybody who does a file new Windows app or a file new the WPF app, they basically will always be guaranteed to run on Win 7 or higher, which the analyzer will know because that's what the TFM already says. And so they never have to write an if check. So the only case we would have to write an if check for this is basically when you are in a generally portable class library, right? And then you say, I want to access the registry if I'm running on Windows. But in that case, you generally don't want to apply an attribute because you're basically saying, my API handles this extra case for my callers transparently, right? And so that's why I think class libraries will generally do that. And then if you look at iOS and Android, I mean, the idea there is that you're generally on the cutting edge without losing reach, right? So that means you will generally say, I run on an older version of iOS, and if there's any new APIs that I want to call, I'm writing the if check for that. So which basically means the attributes don't help you there either because you are the caller, right? So that doesn't really help.
I mean, this is, I don't have specific strong feelings that it would be the case, but I know that we do have a lot of things that the kind of people who are decorating things with attributes and the kind of people who would be doing the runtime information checks could seem like different people. And if we felt that there was going to be a lot of people who just put attributes on their methods and never use the runtime checks, then maybe it would be in a more friendly namespace than interrupt services.
Yeah, I think the only category I can think of is people who basically change the TFM to be high enough, in which case they don't even have to apply the attribute, right? Because by setting the TFM high enough, we will generate the supported OS platform attribute in the build and apply it at the assembly level, which means they never have to apply an attribute either, because they say my whole app only runs on Win 10 or up, right? In which case, now you don't have to do any checks because you already bumped your minimum requirement all the way up. But as soon as you basically fumble with these things individually, you will most likely, like if you use the attributes directly, you will most certainly also use the methods. I really have a hard time seeing that any other way.
I agree. I think it should go in the same namespace.
But I agree with you that interop services was a poor choice, because I mean originally the motivation for interop services was, well, why are you asking for the OS? Because you're P invoking, and now we have to like, well, or you call it an OS binding, right? And turns out that they're not interop, but the API already shipped, so now it would be weird if the attributes would be in a different namespace from runtime information. So that's the unfortunate thing.
Okay.
But it is a bit
Yeah, really, it was a devil's advocate question.
I mean, we could deprecate the whole type, right, and then introduce a new type. We could do that. But like, I don't
wrapper type.
Or we could have namespace forwarders.
Or we can spend 5 years building a runtime feature.
So the only fallout that comes from this decision is we have the OS platform attribute, which is used by both target platform attribute and these supported and unsupported. Where does that one go? Maybe it doesn't really matter because nobody actually interacts with that attribute.
That is a good question. I mean, like, I guess this one doesn't really matter. Like, the only reason why I added this was if you're on the docs, you can click on OS platform attribute and it shows you the derived types. And that seemed useful. But that one also doesn't care about the namespace, right? Because links will work regardless of what we do there.
Is target platform attribute deriving from it the right thing?
I believe it does. Let me.
I know. I'm asking is.
Should it?
Right.
Oh. That's.
I know it's
question.
not in this proposal, but it kind of is a fallout from this proposal.
I mean, in principle, the base class itself doesn't really serve any purpose except for the docs, right? And so, I think it's logical to tie them all together, but there really isn't much of a polymorphic aspect to that.
It holds the string. It has the framework name string, or whatever it's called, the platform.
Yeah, I think this one defines the constructor that requires that. So everybody who derives from it has to pass in that guy.
So on the unsupported attribute, we're now accepting a versionless RID-like thing. Is the intent to also support that on supported OS platform and obsoleted, though obsoleted would be weird?
So I say this.
Not obsoleted.
So
Both supported and unsupported support unversioned with this proposal.
Yes, so obsoleted doesn't, because it doesn't make sense to say it. All operating system versions are obsoleted.
Yeah, and presumably obsoleted's not allowed to be the bottom of the stack.
It's not explicitly disallowed, but it would be not useful, yes, to do that. So basically what the spec calls out is that obsoleted in and of itself does not make any claims about availability, right? But it generally doesn't make sense to apply it unless you're already in a supportive context, which we could teach the analyzer about it. Say if you apply obsoleted without without the platform being considered supported for this API, there would be an authoring bug on the API.
Okay, I was just making sure that we were explicit as to where we landed on the version numbers for support. And so we're okay with just marking something as supported OS platform Windows. And that means we believe it works in all versions of Windows that you'll ever encounter. And we can raise it later if we feel like it. And it's not supported anywhere else.
For example, registry.
Yeah, because the bottom version of Windows is supported, therefore it's an exclusive list. So nothing else is supported.
Does anyone care about where OS platform lives?
You mean OS platform attribute, the base class?
Yeah.
I don't care.
I don't really care. If I was to pick one, I would pick in the same place OS platform exists.
I'd probably put it elsewhere just so it doesn't show up in IntelliSense.
So
yeah, I thought about the two interrupt
gonna
services is already very full though. It probably doesn't make a difference. I mean, I'm okay with leaving it in system runtime.versioning because that's already it's basically nothing really is in that namespace that you would ever interact with directly, and the attribute is probably in that category. So I would probably just leave it in that namespace.
So are we defining that using a string like Windows or iOS works like means all versions, or does it work the same way as in TFMs in Net5? As in it maps to an explicit version.
It means version 0.0.
Yeah, it will be universal claim.
Which is the third to last bullet in the list on the screen right now.
Yeah, so we should probably like very explicitly call out that is a different behavior than the very similarly looking strings in TFMs.
That is true.
Because yeah, like Windows without a version in the new style TFMs means something very, very different.
What does it mean? I guess I don't know.
So if you have an unversion, if you have a target platform identifier and you don't have a target platform version, that implicitly means that will map to an implicit version which is defined somewhere in the targets.
But it's like the lowest one that we support.
Right? Yes, but it will be like basically a hard-coded mapping that is somewhere in the MS build targets.
Or in the case of Windows, one version lower than the lowest version.
It's not going to be like 0, 0. Like in Windows, it'll be like Windows 7 or something. So yeah.
But logically, I mean, at a high enough level, it's all versions, right? Like if in my TFM I'm saying I'm net50-Windows, that means all Windows versions, all of the ones that are supported.
Yeah. I'm not objecting to this behavior. I just think we should be explicit calling out that it is an intentional decision that even though these things look exactly like that portion of the TFM, they are not quite the same.
Right. Well, in the TFM that's only build time. Like I assume that actually gets expanded into a version.
And so that mapping will not be available at runtime.
Right. So
And
everything at runtime and
at
NuGet packages and whatnot all see this was actually .NET Windows 7. Only like the solution sees that it was .NET-Windows. So.
And yeah, if you have any of those implicit versions at build time, they will get baked into concrete versions during the build. Mm-hmm. But that wouldn't apply to strings in source code, of course.
Yes, I mean, I know we're not talking about that particular feature design right now, but I'll point out that means that over time, that means that NuGet packages will explode without you realizing that they're getting bigger. That you moved from having an iOS 12 to an iOS 13 to an iOS 14 because the SDK kept changing its minimum version.
No, the SDK won't keep changing its minimum version. Like net5-iOS will always mean like net5-iOS.
So for 5, it will always mean a version, and then for 6, it
now
will always mean a version.
Net 6 might have a different minimum version, but
that's fine then.
Yeah.
I withdraw my concern.
And there's also some design work around like baking those mappings into any NuGets you compile, so NuGet doesn't have to be aware of it, and so on. So it's pretty thoroughly thought out. But yes, that information will not be available at runtime. So yeah, I think this is fine. I just think we need to explicitly call it out because those do look like TFM substrings.
Yeah, so as far as the namespace, assuming that someone gets annoyed by the show me all namespaces and turns that feature off, and so we can go back to saying namespaces help IntelliSense. If you start typing OS platform, you probably want OS platform and not OS platform attribute, because OS platform attribute is effectively useless. So having it in a different namespace is actually valuable. So I would leave OS platform attribute in system whatever version, whatever. The one that you're not going to use.
So you said basically leave the base type with system runtime versioning?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because no one ever needs to interact with it.
Yes, I agree with that.
So if we're using namespaces as logical groupings for IntelliSense, it does not belong with OS platform because you're not going to use them at the same time. You're going to use the concepts at the same time, but not the types. So this is the separating your type hierarchy based on, power level.
At what level is this attribute even useful?
Which one?
Linking and docs.
OS platform attribute?
This is only useful in the docs, so when you click on it, it shows you the derived type, so it basically gives you a logical grouping of these attributes. But it doesn't add anything else.
Do we do that elsewhere?
Yes, we have. I think we had this at some point in attributes where I think Christoph suggested this for several other attributes that are related. For example, everything that's related to linker, linker hints probably should have a base type, so you basically can group them together. It doesn't do anything. I mean, polymorphism in attributes doesn't buy you anything because you generally don't instantiate them, but like it's still useful for docs to say, here's a family of attributes and they logically belong to each other.
Okay.
But yeah, there's
essentially it gives us a natural place for the concept pages.
Yeah.
So the 3 move over to runtime interrupt services, supported, obsolete, and unsupported.
Yeah, good point. I should also call it obsolete.
Yeah, the 3 things that people will apply to their own methods.
I feel like it's kind of unfortunate we're going to be ending up with system runtime interrupt services in a lot of people's files.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't like, because it's basically this dumping ground for code that we want most people to not write. But
I mean, a lot of people will already have it because they're going to use runtime information. With the existing proposal, they would also now have runtime versioning, which nobody's ever. I had to go look it up to see what was even in there.
Yeah. And that was my question of, do we expect people to use the attributes without the runtime information checks? Because if yes, then maybe we should put them in system. And if people using the attributes are already likely to be talking about runtime information, then putting them in the same namespace is better.
I think generally people will be using a mixture, but that mixture might tend towards one end or the other. Like it's definitely plausible that you could have a library where certain APIs they're using have a higher OS requirement than their library's minimum requirement, and they want to propagate that requirement to their API, but they don't want to do any like runtime checks themselves. They just want to propagate that up to their API. And so they're going to just be using attributes and not runtime checks. And user code might just be using runtime checks. So there will be extremes. I would imagine that a lot of code will use a mixture, though.
Yeah, and it feels like if we're not confident that the amount of places that would be attribute only is high, that reducing the namespace span on things people will write has a certain value.
Yeah, I don't think there's many places that there will be only attributes. Like even in the library case I just described, like that's the extreme case. In a lot of cases, they probably want to, for example, hide that requirement under a method with a lower requirement that internally does a runtime check and has a fallback or something.
Yep. So, yeah, It feels like these 3 in interop services, and then the other 2 in versioning is the best we're going to do, and we'll be upset with it in a couple of years. But whatever.
I also imagine that most people who are writing code that needs this are doing some kind of interop in the first place.
Yeah, you say that, but like I think if you're building an iOS and Android app, you're very unlikely to do interop. You're just calling OS bindings, and you still have to use these APIs.
Yeah, we're talking like all iOS and Android apps.
That's the thing that I don't like. But the really basically the only alternative to this would be we would have to basically duplicate at least runtime information. We can probably get away with not duplicating OS platform, because realistically people will pass in strings here because they have to do version checks anyway. But I don't like duplicating a type just because we messed up the namespace. That seems a fairly expensive fix as well. But I don't have another option. I mean, what is true is that runtime information today is also largely useless for us because it only has isOS platform. Like all the actual worker methods that actually do anything useful, like that compare version numbers, are all net new. We just put them on runtime information because that's where isOS platform already is. But there really isn't a super, and the type also is not like, super large either, right? It's a very small type. Yeah, that's basically what the type has today.
I mean, if you're taking an iOS and Android specific view at this, yes. But in the case of, like, I'm checking for Windows and reading registry, or I'm checking for not browser and not calling some API that's not going to work on Blazor WASM, the existing isOS platform works perfect for you.
Right. I mean, like, the thing to me, there's 2 sides to it, right? So we could decide as a new type, we put in a new namespace or in an existing namespace that is better than interop services. That's where the attributes go, and that's great for iOS and Android, but nothing prevents us from teaching the analyzer about, runtime information isOS platform, and also have that as a legal guarding call as well. Because we already said we want to make isOS platform also legal as a guard if the version is basically 0, right? So like we will still handle that. It's just a question of like, if you build an iOS app, do you really want to have interop services in pretty much every file, right? Maybe not every file, but large
if the
number of files.
alternative is splitting where we tell you to go check for what OS you're running on, right? Like we already have environment.os junk that we're like, don't go there. And we told everybody to go here. Now we're saying, don't go here either. Like go to this other place. Like how many times are we going to?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. I mean, honestly, like if we were to design it from scratch, right, I would probably put methods on environment rather than introducing a new type. Because, I mean, I agree with you, like, it is unfortunate, but if you compare runtime information, right, like this is 2%, right, compared to environment, what is it, OS version, which is like this, right? So you could argue that, runtime information was, so we did runtime information because this property was considered bad. I mean, it still kind of is bad because it tells you the version number rather than allowing you to ask whether you're compatible, right? But like, arguably, like this class is probably closer to what people would search for in the first place.
It's tricky you use those numbers though, right? Because nobody's running their net new .NET Core code through API port.
Oh, totally. I mean, I'm just arguing for like 20 years of heritage, right? Like that's.
Yeah. If you're using the tool that's only measuring the code base that was 20 years ago, like, of course, it's going to be more.
Because what are your, what are the relative sizes for NuGet content?
NuGet is like 200,000 or something. API.
Well, I just mean like you've got like 2% on this one, and what was it on the previous one?
Let's look here. This is 1.4%, and then this would be 0.4%.
Okay.
So it's not a 10x.
Yeah, these are more likely to be code people are writing today.
Well, the problem is libraries have like different kind of scenarios, right? As a library author, you're not like, it's kind of different to ask for APIs and libraries than it is for apps, right? Like for example, an iOS app is
abstracting a concept.
Right, but like so the problem with iOS and Android is like you are more bleeding edge, whereas as a library author you're generally not super bleeding edge, right? That's why my concern with iOS and Android is we just make it net worse for everybody when everybody is likely having to write these calls, right? That's why I don't like interrupt services, because interrupt services is largely a junk namespace, right? I mean, not everything in here is in .NET Core, but like large chunks of it are still, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we could do complicated things, I would maybe just move runtime information up to system runtime, which is a very, very empty namespace. But
well, system runtime I would not use. That's the what is the term? It's the namespace that Christoph used for the runtime team when they came with wacky APIs, right? So it's basically, yeah, you never need any of this, right?
Yeah, fair enough. But since we can't, I mean, yeah, I don't think that we really want to move.
How about this? I will sit down, I write up a proposal that we then can reject with gusto if we feel like it, but I can at least sketch what it would look like if we were to do it, and then we can judge whether we like the result or not. Because I mean, the problem with namespace forwarding is, yes, if we had this, I would use it. I just don't think it's very likely to ever happen, so I'd rather not bet my future on it.
Right. The only forwarding that we would get is we would just duplicate the type name in a new place, and then just tell people, go call the other version of this instead, which would then be hard on them if they needed something in interrupt services already, because they'd have to using alias to get the correct one, which would be unfortunate. So yeah, I think we really need the runtime feature before we would move the type.
None of this is happening for 5.0 though, right? Like,
no, like that's why I'm hesitant to add APIs in 5.0 if we feel like that's not the right story for iOS and Android, because realistically that's what they will have to use until like magic
I mean,
happens.
I think it's if we took everyone feeling a little uneasy about these being in interrupt services and said we were willing to do the ugly work of cloning runtime information and OS platform in a different namespace that was more appropriate to the current usage of them, then we would probably do that now or never. And so I think that the question is applicable to 5. Otherwise, we'll say that the type's too big and used by too many things, and we'd also have to move the attributes, and that is bad for anything doing metadata analysis based off doing the COM metadata importer, because now they would need to understand namespace aliases as well, unless the COM library did it for them, and everything would be terrible. So I think we either get the attributes where we want them now, or we'll never move them.
Yeah, that seems the most likely outcome. I agree. All right, so I think we discussed this to death. I'll follow up on the locations to make it a bit more sexy, but I think this is having legs. I like it.
Why does target platform attribute redefine platform name if it got it from the base class?
Because my spec is garbage.
Okay. You're welcome.
Let me fix this.
Yeah, so you do have, as one thing here, you have I think the obsoleted in platform has a platform ID and a message. So you have overloading on that constructor.
Yeah, like, so we keep saying we can overload on constructors. I mean, obsolete does that. Obsolete you can either call with no arguments or with a message.
Fair enough. So we do have the guidance that says avoid doing it. It is the only way that you can assign the message, so it seems okay. Like, it's effectively a nullable parameter, but one of the problems is if you're using the COM metadata scrubber, like, you can't evaluate the two things to know what the difference between them is. So you have to just tell your tool that's using it what the difference between the two constructors is, and to analyze them differently.
but that's true regardless of overloading, right? So even if I don't have this, let's say I don't have this constructor here, the caller has to know what the both arguments mean.
Right, but they're also just, they only have to see, they don't have to compare which method it's going against. They can just see that it's an invocation of the type, and it makes the metadata, the interop analysis thing a lot simpler. But if we think that the overload's just, we're not changing the meaning of platform name, so it's okay in that sense. But I'm just pointing out our guidance is avoid overloading attribute constructors. Doesn't say do not, it's avoid.
Yeah, I still don't quite understand the guidance. Like, I don't understand the complexity, because for me, logically what happens is, right, if you have a metadata reader, it tells you invoke this constructor or that constructor. So you have a metadata reference to the actual constructor. And you basically have the typed arguments that positive or pass to the constructor, right? So like that is true whether you have 3 overloads or just a single method, right?
Right. I mean, the biggest reason it's giving is don't have some get set properties that one constructor sets some of the properties and another one doesn't, because then you have to train the mapping of the flow through.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
But it's largely, it's the big foofy, like, you have some logic in this constructor, and every other constructor you add, every tool that needs this attribute needs to understand that same exact logic, and it can't ever change.
Yes.
And
no, that is true.
So it's save on thinking.
Yeah, I mean, like, so the guidance basically is like, don't rely on logic in the constructor, because you have to replicate that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I can relate to that. All right, so then we're happy with what we see on screen, right?
Yep.
Cool. Then we have 40 minutes left for other stuff. Levi, do you want to talk about secure string?
Sure, why not? I enjoy a good dog pile.
That escalated quickly already. We haven't even opened the tab yet.
Yeah. So this is something we've been wanting to do for a while. To obsolete the secure string, not necessarily to obsolete the type, but to obsolete its usage within the framework. And the reason for that is twofold. First off, because secure string is an exchange type, we generally don't like obsoleting exchange types because it makes it very noisy in your code base. Instead, what we want to do is to obsolete either the creation or consumption of that exchange type. But if you have a field of this type, for instance, like we just don't want to cause noise in your project and force you to suppress that warning. But the reason that we wanted to obsolete this in general is that secure string doesn't really honor many of the promises that it makes. And in fact, we document, hey, you can't actually rely on secure string to fulfill its documented guarantees, which is a bit unfortunate. We've seen a few cases in the past where people are using this type as how do I want to phrase this? People are using this type because they feel like they have an engineering imperative to do so, where they're contorting their code in order to use this because it has the word secure in its name, or because they believe it makes guarantees that it actually doesn't. And as a result, the code that they're using around this type becomes more difficult to read, more difficult to maintain. It's not the type of code that we think .NET consumers should be writing, really. Also, this type can't be used in things like HIPAA-compliant environments, for instance. Like using this type doesn't make your application magically HIPAA compliant or PCI compliant or anything like that, whereas a bunch of our consumers apparently believe that to be the case. So these are all reasons that we think we should start winding down usage of this type throughout the ecosystem. I had proposed here a particular set of APIs that should be obsoleted. This would not be for .NET 5, it would be for .NET 6. These APIs are, as I mentioned earlier, involved either in the creation of one of these things or in the consumption of one of these things. In an ideal world, we would no longer use secure string to store credentials at all, but we don't live in an ideal world, so we need to be able to have credentials in memory, like symmetric keys, stuff like that. one of the things that I had proposed here is using network credential actually as a wrapper around any arbitrary in-memory or not in-memory cred that we might want to pass around in the future. For example, process.start, the overloads that take secure string should be obsoleted, and we should only take overloads that take a network credential if the overloads need to take a credential at all. That way we have one credential type that we pass around as the exchange type through the framework. Does that kind of make sense as a scenario?
I mean, layering's probably all messed up, but.
Oh yeah, layering's horrendous here. But
have to forward that out.
Yeah, in a nutshell, that's where all of this is going though. I'm not proposing changing the user observed behavior of secure string, even though the APIs that construct or consume it would be obsolete. If your code suppresses the warnings and then calls the APIs, they would behave as expected.
You mentioned that a lot of industry is using this, hoping that it gives them some security. Do we have anything for them to migrate to that is correct?
So I'm not entirely familiar with all of the requirements that might be applicable there, but the big thing that I think we should be saying is, if you don't want secrets to be in crash dumps or otherwise accessible to people who have access to your process, don't have secrets themselves accessible to your process. What that might entail, for instance, is say that you have an N-tier web service, you have a front end and a back end. The front end shouldn't be able to decrypt any of the secrets at all that are flying across. The secrets should be encrypted from the client directly to the back end, for instance, and the front end should not have any type of accessibility for that. Things along those lines.
So, Corey, the problem space ends up being something like, this is massively paraphrasing, of course, for PCI compliance, a secret must be erased from memory as soon as it is no longer needed. Well, most people who build secure strings do it wrong. They have a system.string and then they build a secure string. So now they've made a copy. The original string won't get erased because strings don't, I mean, it'll eventually get overwritten, but it's not as soon as they're done. And then anytime they ever actually use the secure string object, secure string is just an expensive in-memory encryption. And then the moment you need it, it gets decrypted, copied into a string and used. And many people do this with their own code, of they'll actually copy it back to a system string to pass it to some other thing, which entirely defeated the purpose. And if it's used in the marshaller, it does use pinned memory, so it does get to clear it. So it's really a marshalling aid, but people think that it's a practical runtime aid, and there's not really a solution we can provide in the framework because they need to do their own. It's complicated, like pinning and copying and slicing, and like there is no simple solution, because it turns out in .NET we like the memory to move, and in PCI they like it to not move.
Yeah,
so.
I have some links throughout this document actually of where in .NET we actually generate strings from secure strings and then never clean them up. And Jeremy's right, like it's the natural way of using one of these things, because system string is the .NET exchange type. It's only natural that people would want to convert data from this to that. But the problem is, like Jeremy said, as soon as you're in that world, like you're no longer compliant.
Yeah, I feel like when we were doing .NET Core 1, we looked on GitHub searching usages of secure string, and it wasn't until like page 22 that we found something that was not just going to or from a system string. So there was a whole lot of anything .NET-y was doing it wrong.
Yeah, and that so then the question becomes like, well, is this type just discouraged, or is it actively harming the ecosystem? And that is something that I actually grappled with, because there are APIs that we don't like, but take ArrayList for instance, right? Like we don't like it, but if you use ArrayList, like, okay, whatever, more power to you, I guess. In this particular case, we're seeing that people are either, as mentioned earlier, believing that their code fulfills some type of compliance requirement and potentially opening themselves up to liability. Or in the code that I've seen, at least internally, people are introducing security holes into their applications in order to use this type. One of the things that I discuss in the document was there was code that I looked at where somebody was explicitly trying to clear system string instances but after they had converted the strings into secure strings. And the problem that I pointed out to them was like, hey, you're now corrupting memory in the web server because ASP.NET was still using those strings. Random stuff like that. So yeah, so the obsolescence is telling people like, look, stop using this. Just if you really need to, just pass stuff around as a string. Like if you really need to. If you do that and you need to make sure that secrets are not accessible outside of this process, turn off things like crash dumps. That's obviously going to give you the best protection. That's not necessarily always practical. If that's not practical, then Jeremy had a proposal earlier where the GC could be put into a. And actually, I could just let you talk about that, Jeremy, since you're on the phone.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, for things like the comment of .NET likes to move memory around, it's the make the GC every time it does compaction. Because right now, this is the place that people tend to get snippy with us, is they run a test as part of a PCI audit. A secret gets loaded into memory. It gets the point where it's supposed to not be in use anymore, and then they take a manual crash dump, and then they find it in memory. And it's because a compaction happened in the middle, and it's now abandoned memory. And as a perf optimization, the GC won't clear that memory until it flashes the page to start handing data out of it again. So I have an outstanding request for the GC to have a mode that says anytime you run compaction, you need to delete all the source, like clear all the source memory as part of doing the compaction, which makes compaction more expensive. So it'll probably want to do it less often. So you'll be fragmented more often. And but it lets you do things like if you had a byte array that held the secret, that it wouldn't have gotten copied before you had a chance to pin it. And honestly, you wouldn't even need to pin it at that point, because the only reason you would pin it is to prevent the compaction copy. But yeah, so like that solves one aspect of the problem, which is one of the problems that also comes about with secure string, but secure string just is full of problems.
So like I didn't quite catch, like what is the solution to the problem? Like basically this thing is permanently pinned. Is that what you said?
So if you really care about, if you need to pass a PCI audit, the number one recommendation is don't, which is don't touch credit cards yourself. Like use a service that is PCI audited and give them encrypted data, and you never get to see it, and you're so happy that you never had the PAN, aka the credit card number, because the moment you can see the credit card number, your life becomes miserable. So, but if you do need to do that, then yeah, you need to have everything in pinned memory so that you can call clear on it before the GC compacts it. And it's very not .NET-y, because you can't call anything that would return a byte array that would have the secret in it, because that could have been copied in compaction 3 times from the time it was filled to the time that you got it. I mean, probably not, because compaction's not going to move it twice, but
unless you use the new pinned object heap, but that's probably something you don't want to use either.
Right. Well, because that would be that you needed whatever API produced the secret needed to have made the array already pinned before it filled it. Right. And
well, it's not just that, but like ASP.NET is giving you back strings, for instance, to represent query string and form field values.
Yeah. And then those are going to be, normal string processing. And so it's kind of an entirely intractable problem. The GC clear on compact solves one aspect of the problem.
Yeah.
So maybe
it's necessary but not sufficient.
So maybe I'm missing it, but basically, what was that a proposal of the thing that Levi is suggesting? Is that we have a type that is either permanently pinned or has this clear on compaction behavior?
No, so this document has a few links inside of it. The thing that we were just describing was a mode of operation that Jeremy had proposed for the GC, where whenever the GC moves something around in memory, basically the old copy of it gets zeroed. So you only ever have one copy of the thing in memory. So if you have a byte array, if you have a byte array or a char array or something like that, right now in .NET, when you call .clear on it, you're clearing the most recent copy of it, but there might be 2 or 3 other copies hanging around. With Jeremy's proposal, you will be clearing the only remaining copy of it, if that matters to you. However, that doesn't address things like system.string because you can't clear them. With Jeremy's proposal, what would happen is, I believe, once that memory gets reclaimed and compacted, the memory will also be zeroed out because it's no longer used. Is that correct, Jeremy?
I mean, I don't remember if we had said that it would do it immediately on dead object reclamation, or if it would, but because the only time that the thing that came up before, which was specifically a PCI complaint that someone had, was that they'd done something that got a byte array. The byte array got compacted before they had a chance to clear it, and so then the key still showed up in memory. But since they were actively calling clear, the thing we were investigating was compaction, not simply what data lifetimes look like. Because I think that the GC team would completely and utterly flip out if we said that as soon as something was being marked as available, that they had to go actively clear all the memory.
Yeah, and by the way, this mode of operation for the GC that we were talking about would have some amount of overhead. It's something that applications would want to opt into if they're operating in such an environment. We wouldn't want to turn this on by default for all applications.
Yeah, so basically what all this is saying is people think secure string already does all this for them, and it doesn't. And it's a hard problem that we still don't even have solutions for. And so we're getting rid of the false promise of any of this being handled by secure string.
Yeah. So one of the other things that this proposal goes over, and I think this is what you were hinting at, Emo, is what would a replacement for secure string look like? And that is proposed around halfway down the document. It's not intended to make any of the promises that secure string ever pretended to make, because we can't make those promises and we shouldn't even pretend to make them. Instead, what this proposed type does, I call it shrouded buffer, but that's a terrible name. What this proposal does is it is a way to wrap a buffer and mark it such that, hey, you caller, you need to make sure that if you're reading the contents of this buffer, you're doing so in an appropriate fashion, where appropriate might differ depending on the kind of application you're writing. For example, there's no way to actually get at the raw backing store of the shrouded buffer. Instead, the only thing you can do is copy its contents into a span that you control. So that means that you could, if you wanted to copy the shrouded buffer into pre-pinned memory, you could either create your own array and then pin it, or create an array from the pinned object heap, or stack alloc an array, or whatever you need to do, and then copy to pass in as the destination the span that you just created, operate on it, and then clear it as necessary as your methods unwind.
So the shrouded buffer then copies on instantiation, right?
Correct. Everything here is span-based, which is intentional, because it being span-based, it makes it very clear that the caller is always in full control over the lifetime of these spans.
So when I dispose the shrouded buffer, I suppose it zeroes out the memory that it was holding onto?
It could.
And would it basically be permanently pinned? But would we prevent the GC from moving us or copying us?
That's an implementation detail, but the way that this is implemented in my prototype is it actually calls heap create to create an entirely new heap where these things are kept. And that's simply a defense in depth mechanism to make sure that an arbitrary dangling pointer can't access the data, for instance.
But again,
it's not a promise, it's just a defense in depth mechanism.
So basically, the type does not claim that it will prevent copies from the GC.
Correct. The type makes no security guarantees whatsoever. The only reason for the existence of the type is to wrap a buffer in such a way that the caller is excruciatingly aware of the fact that the buffer contains privileged information. Like there's no way for this to accidentally show up in a log, for instance. Like in order for this data to show up in a log, the caller explicitly has to unshroud it. And when I say log, I mean like you're calling ilogger.log.
Yeah, presumably, like you don't override toString and return a printable version of the contents, right?
Correct. toString would not return a version of the string. And by the way, that's it, as much as we say like, oh, you should just use string for all of your secrets, or sorry, let me rephrase. If your secret comes in as a string, then you should just leave it as a string and deal with it the way that you would normally deal with strings. Like for most applications, that's actually okay, but doing that increases the risk that a developer will inadvertently include it in a log somewhere, right? So this type is intended to work around that problem, where if you, as part of your app development process, have a policy that you want to prevent these things from showing up in logs, this is one mechanism to try to enforce that throughout your code base.
I mean, one thing that is true is like, you know, in like secure string was never really sufficiently plumbed through the layers that we had, right? I mean, the only really good use was the PowerShell example when they actually have like a method that effectively reads it from the console directly. But it seems like when you look at ASP.NET, for example, like everything is dealing with strings, right? Because you have configuration data that has keys to services and stuff like that, right? And I guess we generally don't care because if you have access to the server process, then you're already screwed, right? So like, what are examples of scenarios where the secrets would matter? Like, would we, like if somebody does a crash dump of your server process, do we actually care that it contains secrets?
Do we care? Generally, no. Does PCI care? Yes. So if you touch credit card data, then you are required by the agreement of all the credit card companies that the moment you no longer needed the credit card data to be unencrypted in memory, it is no longer unencrypted in memory, so that there's only epsilon chance it ever appears in a crash dump.
I see. So then the statement there is like really, it's funny, right? Because secure string was originally designed for passwords, not for PII, really, right? But this one, it would be more like user data, right?
For PCI, it's any cryptographic key for any purpose. Anytime that you have the what they call the PAN, which is the credit card number, and then the CVV or CVV2 code. All of those are considered extraordinarily sensitive and must be erased the moment they are no longer needed. And
it seems like this could be really useful with an analyzer as well, or just searching your code base to do code review on important buffers.
Yeah, see, the thing is, like, that's why I like having a dedicated type, right? Because, like, byte array or strings are just used so pervasively that you can't really write any sort of static analysis with these in mind, right? At the same time, though, like, if we add this type, but we don't actually make it easy for people to construct said type, then I feel like it seems like the secure string problem all over again. Everybody starts with a byte array or a string that they converted to a byte array, and then you're back to square one, right?
Yeah. So this type can be constructed around a string or a byte array because the constructor takes that.
Right, but that's the same thing as saying new secure string passing in a string, right? Like that
which you can't do.
Sure, but
that's
like
right. That's one of the stupid things about it. But yeah.
Yeah, but like
but this would let you do console.readline for the password and pass that into shrouded buffer, which is what you don't want to do because you didn't want it as a system.string.
Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of what I'm getting at. Is like, to me, if we, like, by the way, I'm not opposed to having this type. I'm just saying if we do it, we should probably think through what are the entry points where you get this data, and then make sure we actually have APIs that avoid giving you the data as a byte array or as a string in the first place, and directly giving it to you as a sharded buffer, so that you don't ever have the wrong instance to begin with.
The common way of getting the data into your process, honestly, will be reading the request form from a web service.
Yeah, or out of your config file, or
via configuration
response data from Key Vault, or I mean, we already have things. I know that in your ideal world, Emo, we will delete the entire crypto stack and completely rewrite it, but we have things like symmetric algorithm.key, which really should be, if we'd had shrouded buffer as a concept in .NET 1.0, then it would totally be one of, hey, you'd like pay attention here, this thing's secret. But we don't. So there are already places that are data factories, like the key property on symmetric algorithm. It gives you a clone of the array. Like, yep, it's actually a secret, but like you just need to know that.
Well, that's why I'm saying. I mean, to me, like if we have a type, I think we should probably walk the chain, right? I mean, you know, ASP.NET's configuration mechanism would be another common example how you get access to keys, right? And just making sure that if we have such a type that it's sufficiently recognized by our stack to actually make it easy for people to get one, and then just holding onto it and passing it around, right? I mean, the other thing with secure string is, for the most part, you know, if people would just have to pass these guys around, usability wouldn't be so bad, right? The problem was always that the construction side and the consumption side almost never talks in secure string, right? So you were continuously forced to either transform them or, you know, construct them from something else you already have. And I think if you want to solve the problem of people actually doing inadvertent copies, then that seems the number one thing to go for, right? Just making sure that you only ever deal with these things in a way that we can, you know, provide any sort of like at least mild support for zeroing it out as fast as we can, right?
Well, we could solve that problem by plumbing secure string everywhere also, right? Like we're also trying to... The problem is people are using secure string thinking that it provides them security. How do we prevent this API from giving the same illusion?
Yeah, you're kind of jumping where I'm going with, which is, if the only thing we don't like about secure string is the name, then maybe that's a solvable problem. But like if the thing is, okay, the type doesn't behave the way we want, then that's a different kind of problem, right? But
yeah, well, it's not just the name. It's the fact that it's promoted as a first-class citizen throughout certain APIs. It's the fact that it's mutable also. The fact that creating and reading them encourage contortion of call sites and stuff like that. For instance, I have a sample here turning a shrouded buffer of char into a string, and it's 3 lines of code and has no unsafe API calls whatsoever in it. Like, try doing that with secure string.
We just call everyone's favorite extension method of secure string to string, and
fortunately, that won't work because toString is an instance method, so can't be overloaded as an extension.
Yeah, but people have done.
Jeremy's just pointing out somebody will write the code once, and everybody else is just using it.
Well, I think I've seen the method called secure string to string. This secure string.
Yeah.
And so you end up with, foo.secure string to string.
Yes, and honestly, I don't actually mind stuff like that, and that might be surprising to people, but the reason I don't mind it is because it's very deliberate when the caller is doing that. It's not like I'm passing a secure string instance to string.format inadvertently, and now all of a sudden it's gotten decrypted.
Right, but again, the people that are if you're trying to use secure string, if you were using secure string correctly, you would never turn it into a system string instance. And we updated the guidance to say that as part of core, we had to go update because the description for when secure string was written said a bunch of things that we couldn't make be true on other platforms. And so we changed it to it makes it so it might be encrypted and it probably won't show up in crash dumps, and it
probably.
So
in Linux, you're limited to 26 of them, unless you're root, secure string, because of where we were attempting to meet some of the guarantees, because we end up malloking it in a non-pageable memory section, and there's a limit on that, because that's, as a user, you're not allowed to say I'm taking all of the system memory, and so it's secure string, it's painted itself into a corner.
Yeah, and by the way, the threat model here would be different. I actually had some conversations with our own internal OS security team, and like I wouldn't mark any of these pages as non-pageable because like if it gets written to the swap file and an admin can read the swap file, whatever. We weren't trying to hide from the admin, but apparently there are ways in Windows to mark a page as please don't include me in any crash dumps that you might have. There is an upper bound on the number of such pages, but that's something that we could look into as a defense in depth mechanism here, but it would not be a promise.
Well, that's my other question of like, no matter what we do is like, I think if we can't have a somewhat sound cross-platform solution, it also seems bad, right? Because we don't want to live in a world where it's secure on Windows, but like, bad on Linux, right? It would not be a winning proposition.
Sure. Well, but again, it's not intended to be secure. Maybe that's what's throwing people off. It's intended to be a marker more than anything else.
Right. Like, I guess, okay, secure was the wrong terminology, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is we should not have drastically different behaviors that would make one environment way more resilient to these things than others, right? That seems also bad. Which is kind of the problem of secure string, right? Because my understanding is on Linux, we basically do nothing, right? We just keep the data as is.
Yeah.
That's also bad because if you actually look and you read into it, this behaves on Windows by encryption, and then on Linux it doesn't encrypt. That's a pretty drastic behavior change.
I don't think there's anything bad about following whatever best hygiene might be on the various platforms, and if that best hygiene happens to be different on the different OSs, so be it. That doesn't strike me as a bad thing, but we definitely don't want to make guarantees that we can't fulfill.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, like, I guess for me, it's like, so the problem, I mean, on the one hand side, I agree with the principle that we should be platform native, right? Whatever the behavioral platform is the most idiomatic should be the one we follow. My concern is just that people who target .NET very often also use .NET as a way to abstract away the operating system, so they may not actually care, and they may actually just want like somewhat of a sound experience across all operating systems that .NET runs on, right? And that's why if we have drastically different behaviors that are surprising, that might be bad, right? I mean, you could argue that, you can't run WinForms on Linux, and that might be surprising for people, but I would argue that most people will not be terribly surprised by that, versus, if something gets zeroed out on Windows all the time and never gets zeroed out on Linux, that might be surprising, right? I think we need to find some sort of spot where we can reasonably say, yep, we have somewhat of a sound behavior across all platforms, and it might be slightly different, or might use different semantics, but it's as you said, most appropriate for every platform.
Yeah.
Didn't Jan mention something like a mechanism where you can exclude certain things from crash dumps?
Yeah, he mentioned a Linux mechanism, and I looked into a Windows one, and they do exist on both OSs.
And are they page oriented, or are they basically like, here's some sort of string that you should remove from the crash dump manually?
I don't know if it's page granularity. I think it's memory range granularity.
Gotcha.
But there is a finite number that you can exclude though. So it would still be
already
difficult.
using in secure string on Linux.
Yeah. Even on Windows, it's a finite number. I think it's 512.
512 ranges or 512 bytes?
Ranges. And again, it doesn't prevent the data from going into a swap file. It just prevents the data from being collected in a crash dump, which is within the threat model of this particular type is perfectly allowable, because this type is not intended to defend against somebody who has access to the full process memory. This type is intended to defend against accidental disclosure, not against intentional disclosure. I mean, hell, there's an API to get at the raw data.
I'm reading YouTube comments and I'm amused.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me. And then basically how would you describe then the entry points? Like, do you think that people do what you have on screen right now, or do you think there will be high level methods to do these kind of things, like console dot, read shrouded buffer, for example?
I anticipate that most people will end up with the data inside of a string or a byte array when it first comes into the application, either because they read it from config or request form or something like that. But if they want to use it, then I would anticipate them wrapping the data inside of this, losing the reference to the original piece of data, and then just letting the GC handle it.
But
at that point, it would be minimizing exposure.
Right, but that would not address Jeremy's, what is it, PCI concern, right?
Right, but this type is not intended to address the. This type is not intended to provide security guarantees. It's intended to provide markers.
Signaling.
Yeah. It's intended to enforce hygienic usage, really, more than anything else.
So is it then fair to say that we generally don't care about PCI certification because we can't provide it with the platform? Or
I wouldn't say that. I would just say that you have to write your code in a very specific manner to accomplish it.
You have to write C# v1 with unsafe. Is that what you're saying?
No, so the way that I would do it, like seriously, the way that I would do it is I would do the N-tier thing that I mentioned earlier, where I have a front end that's doing most of the data processing and maybe can even access things like databases, but it can't actually decrypt the raw data. And there's a backend server where I've disabled crash dumps and I'm running a small trusted, a small TCB inside of that backend service, and that's the only thing that can actually access raw credit card data.
So what did you call it? A small what?
TCB, trusted computing base.
I see.
Basically, the code running inside of that backend process is as small as humanly possible, and it's geared only toward processing this kind of stuff. It doesn't have access to databases. It doesn't have access to the actual request. Like, it's not a typical ASP.NET app. But that N-tier architecture is how I would do it if I'm going for compliance.
And it sounds like this type would just be a primitive that you would use there, but it would not be the full solution.
Correct.
Yeah,
inside the front end, I could keep having stuff as a string or a byte array because it would be encrypted the entire time.
And so, like, just to be clear, like from a PCI standpoint, like, is it not enough? So what I'm trying to basically say is, like, how far could we push it if we cared enough, right? So if we actually would have, equivalence methods of, like, read shorted buffer on, the most common entry points you'll get data from, which aren't managed memory yet, would that be sufficient for PCI compliance, or would it still be like, no, you have to do some other crazy gymnastics that you basically have no influence over unless you write some unsafe code?
You'd have to disable the array pool.
So Twitter warned me that this was perhaps a review I ought to get involved in. So here I am, because someone mentioned secure string. And I don't think we can ever make statements about PCI compliance, aside from the fact that it's a moving target. And what someone could say is PCI compliant 1 year may not be PCI compliant the next. It's also quite use and auditor dependent in that PCI compliance is a point in time thing. We've seen an awful lot of breaches of systems that passed their PCI compliance, and I really don't want us to start making claims around the PCI compliance of the framework, because it's not just the programming language, it's the environment, it's the ACLs, it's the DACLs, it's everything.
Right. Yes, and I think that's actually a really good point that Barry just mentioned. Like, just like how we don't want to say that this type is a security-oriented type, we don't want to say that the framework itself is compliant. Rather, you can build compliant things on top of it, but it itself is not.
Right.
So I get that. From the PCI perspective, like, you're accepting a credit card number, right? So if you accept the credit card number the client sends it over TLS, but plain text through the TLS channel, so the server receives it. If it receives it now in a system.string object, you are now not in compliance unless at the moment that request ends, that string is erased. And we currently don't have infrastructure for that. So you can be in still meeting things if the client sends it encrypted to a session encryption key that you've somehow managed, and you decrypt that into memory that you are managing, that you can load it into it, do what you need to do, and then clear it before the request ends. But you end up there's a lot of complexity as to what it means when and this is in fact a thing I've even heard that the auditors aren't consistent about. Not to thankfully I don't know any, so I'm not putting anyone on the spot. But what does it mean for a request to be over? And so like there's a bunch of ambiguity and a bunch of terms. But the biggest problem to solve if you're doing that is if you ever get inside a system.string object, we don't support you clearing the memory behind it directly.
Right.
And so it now needs to be like it's now garbage collector features that we need for managing that data. And
yeah, I want to springboard on that. It's not just that. You would also have to disable the ASP.NET slab allocator. You would have to disable arraypool.shared because the data goes through that too before it even hits system string.
Yeah, and so there are complexities, but while we wouldn't say that we are building a thing that makes it easy to attain PCI compliance or is internally PCI compatible, we also won't make the statement. And in fact, I will, on behalf of John, before he yells at me, make the statement that .NET does not officially not care about PCI.
So like PCI aside, it sounds like it sounds like the conclusion from this is that we don't really have a good end-to-end story that would necessitate this type being introduced. That's the feedback I'm getting.
Well, that's
right,
kind of what I'm
really
trying to like.
Right.
Yeah.
It just says pay attention to the usage of this, and if we think it's valuable as a signaling device, then it could be valuable as a signaling device. But it's not providing security. It's not helping in things other than it's giving you a place to look to see if you were internally consistent and using shrouded buffer for crypto keys, for pans, for any of that kind of stuff. That as long as you're consistent in it, it gives you fewer places to look in your code to find out are you doing something wrong.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like what I want to avoid is that we build effectively, secure string's cousin, right, with all the same problems, right? So that if we believe that we want to have as a primitive for other people to build something on top of it that could be PCI compliant, then the question is how do we actually help people doing that? Because I feel like if we don't actually add the equivalent of console.read, crowded buffer or request get data in sharded buffer or whatever, then the question is how hard is it actually for people to do? And if you still have 99% of the exercise left to the reader, then the 1% doesn't do much for you anymore, right? And then the question really is it actually worth the complexity of having another type, having to explain it and maintaining it, or is it just better to just say, sorry, we don't help you with that, you do it yourself?
No, that's a really good question, but I think at that point we're delving out of the realm of API design and more into the realm of what behavior do our frameworks offer, period. Like,
totally.
Barry, since you're on the line, like does ASP.NET even offer the ability to turn off its slab allocator?
Not that I'm aware of.
So that just kills it dead in the water right there until that feature comes online.
Well, we could still drive it all the way, right? We could say like, we want to have this as a primitive building block. And in order for us to expose these things, there's these other features that we need fundamentally to make it viable, right?
Yeah,
I'm just asking whether we want to do that.
Yeah.
Like if you're not willing to, then
I think it's valuable anyway because this proposal links to things like the GC mode of operation that we talked about earlier, where things get zeroed on compaction.
Right.
As part of this exercise, then we say, look, this API isn't appropriate without all these other things in addition. So yeah, then we just start building up a list of them.
Right.
But it's a useful conversation, I think.
Totally. Like I'm not saying no, I'm not saying yes. I'm just asking which direction are we heading, right? Like I just don't want to have a slightly better secure string because that seems not useful.
No, and that's fair. So the action item for me then is we need to figure out what changes we need to make either to the framework or to ASP.NET to really allow this to shine on its own.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem will be that, if you look at a PCI, can you decrypt or can you encrypt some material, send it to the client, read it back as sensitive and decrypt it all while doing things, let's call it sensibly, for lack of a better term. Like, what things would we need to do? Like, so symmetric algorithm, like, what do we do about the fact that we already have the existing key property that returns a byte array? Like, there are places that make a lot of things hard. And yes, it's if they never read back that property, then they're probably fine. But when they gave us the thing, they had to give us an array currently, and then we have to copy it. And so maybe we can add an overload somewhere to get this data. But it's all about figuring out if we wanted to say make PCI Hello World easy, then we'd have to trace everything.
We'd also have to have a long and interesting discussion with the lawyers before we would ever make that sort of claim.
Yeah, that's why I don't want to make the claim that the framework itself is compliant. We want to be able to allow building compliant applications on top of it.
If you wanted to make a sample that was conceptually trying to follow similar rules to what the PCI DSS spec as of the last time they published it says, and we wanted to make that look simple, then what are the things we would need to do? Did I say enough weasel words, Barry?
I think it's very lucky that we're all working from home right now. Otherwise, I would be across the desk with something heavy.
There.
But
I choked myself.
Yeah, I know.
But I guess that's, I mean,
you see what I'm saying? We can't make it. It was like when ASP.NET had when we added the GDPR extension points to ASP.NET. Nowhere did we ever say that ASP.NET was GDPR compliant. It's just that we gave you some extension points to help you meet some of your obligations under your GDPR compliance audit.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to like come up with a legally passing thing. I'm just kind of asking the question of, as a product owner, like what is the thing that we want to enable people to do, right? And I think to me there's kind of two scenarios. You can either say we don't care about PCI compliance in the sense that if you wanted, you build the code yourself and you have to read the spec, you have to understand it. There's a bunch of stuff you have to do for that. Or we're saying, okay, we give you building blocks similar to the GDPR extension points, and we carefully document what those are, what the behaviors are, and what you can and cannot do. But then if we do the latter, then I think there is some more end-to-end than just having this type. I don't think the type in and of itself would be sufficient to check that box.
Yes.
I think you're correct. Here's a question. Do any other languages and frameworks say, hey, this is what you should use to help meet your PCI compliance requirements? I've not seen anything, although I'm sure certain languages and frameworks that belong to another large corporation probably have an enormous paid-for offering that comes with consultancy that might help.
So
in base language itself.
To your question, there are two solutions that I've seen. The first is that if you can just pop in a different VM that makes these guarantees on your behalf, then do so. The second is just if your auditors are concerned about things like crash dumps containing secrets, disable crash dumps.
Yeah.
Yeah,
a different VM's interesting.
Yeah, the biggest.
Not that I'm suggesting we do it. I just think it's interesting.
The biggest solution that I've seen is that you just write everything in C, where nothing is free, and you had to do all the work, and therefore you did all the work according to the spec. So, but even that actually fails depending on your auditor, because Windows uses what's the IPC? RPC to send asymmetric key operations into the LSA, and there's a shared buffer in that will effectively hold whatever the last thing that went across to the LSA was. So the last thing that you encrypted or decrypted is technically still in memory somewhere, and I've seen that come up, and it got a 1 demerit report, and Windows is like, we can't fix this, and so it's like, yep, everybody gets a 1 demerit, or you have to do I encrypted a thing and then I flushed the buffer by encrypting another thing, and what did I encrypt? Nothing, so it flushed the buffer.
Okay. No, I think the next steps for me are clear then.
So what are we doing with this? And are we saying needs work?
Yeah, so I don't feel comfortable really obsoleting secure string unless we have a good end-to-end story behind what people should use as a replacement for it. So yeah, I would mark this as needs work, figure out what a good end-to-end story is, and then see what else we're missing in the framework, not just this API.
I mean, I can say that I feel like we recently added API to X509 Certificate 2, and we copied, it was the spanification of the constructors, and we did not copy the secure string one. So we're already signaling that secure string is not the way to go. But so the marking the constructors on X509 certificate 2 that take it as obsolete, I have no problem with that. It's just a question of, would we want to do things piecemeal or have the full plan before we start? And I assume we want the full plan before we start.
Yeah, even I, who hate secure string with the fire of 1,000 suns, would feel that not that we can offer an equivalent, because we can't, because the guarantees that secure string made were a nonsense in a lot of cases. But I think we need guidance and, the zeroing garbage collector and a bunch of other useful tools to try and get people to a secure-ish area.
Yeah, and that's why I commented on hygiene earlier, right? I want to encourage more hygienic use of these APIs, even if it's not 100% bulletproof.
So to be clear though, I don't agree with the statement that we need to have a replacement before we can obsolete it. I think it's completely reasonable for us to say, sorry, this feature can't be implemented because that's just not how a managed runtime with a GC can work realistically. So we're not going to solve the problem, and you shouldn't rely on this type to do it for you because we can't. And here's some guidance on what you might do instead, and that might just be write some unsafe code and wipe the buffers out yourself, right? That to me would be sufficient as a replacement. It doesn't have to be, an actual type. So I feel like sometimes it seems like we're not obsoleting things because we can't build the perfect thing, but maybe the answer is we obsolete it because the perfect thing is just unattainable.
And that's fine. I think we just would need to decide that that's the plan that we think is the plan.
Yes.
And we need the bandwidth to actually create that documentation.
Right, but I mean, it could literally be like what I just said in slightly longer words, right? It doesn't have to be a full-blown, I
believe we would have to do slightly more customer research than...
I think it would be weird if we, it's one thing to not overload the members fully, but if we were to mark the secure string based constructors on X509 certificate 2 as obsolete now, and then in the next version add shrouded buffer and add those constructors, it's weird to do that across 2 versions instead of one where we're being this one's bad, this next one is less bad.
Slightly less bad, yeah.
So that one I buy.
It feels like an inconsistent message.
I think you're right that we need to make the decision before we obsolete it, which way we go. But I don't think obsoletion is predicated on the fact that we have a replacement. I think we need to have the guidance. I agree with that, but I think the guidance also can be dialable, right? We don't have to solve every problem that secure string claimed it would solve. But I think fundamentally, to me, the bigger problem with secure string is, let's say we had the guidance, and let's say for a second that we would convince ourselves that building sharded buffer or anything else would be not a good idea, and we would just say, sorry, there is no replacement besides writing native code. If we were to obsolete it now, the question is, what other APIs are you now basically unable to use at all, because the only way to use it right now would be via secure string, right, or our PowerShell friends who use it throughout the system, right? So we would have to at least make sure that, when we obsolete something, that you can actually use the framework in maintenance scenarios without using obsoleted technologies, right? That to me is the bigger thing we need to go through than necessarily the replacement type.
Yeah, and PowerShell's usage I was thinking of as well, even though I don't really document it here. I wouldn't be opposed to them. First off, I think they should have ownership of the type, to be perfectly honest. But they would use it primarily as a marker type, which, sure, whatever. That's kind of what shrouded buffer is too. It's a marker type. Just saying, please don't log it.
In PowerShell's defense, they do have one of the only correct capture methods I've ever seen. They have a version of console.readSecureString, which only uses stacked data to hold the stuff as they're building up the secure string.
Yeah.
But
and then they pass it to the networking APIs that decrypt it.
Yeah.
And shove it into a system string.
Yeah. And but yeah, so my opinion is that we want to feel comfortable in a decision which is either here are the parts that we are proposing as replacements, and then for other parts saying, and we're not proposing replacing this part, but that we feel that we've covered the aspects of the usage of secure string, and we've said, for this kind of thing, this is what you might want to do. For this kind of thing, this is what you might want to do. And for this kind of thing, we have no idea, but we can't help you. And that we know what that is before we start flapping the attributes around. That's my only feel. Like, I don't care that we solve any problems, just that we've decided that we're not going to solve them, instead of we haven't solved them. And yes, we can decide later that we're going to solve them, but we need to have a strong belief that if we're not going to have a, you give me a thing and I will keep it encrypted in memory notion, then and then we think that that's a user problem, then that's fine. We just need to decide that. Hint, we should decide that. Because we can't make it work on Linux in a sensible way.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, so that's
we are over time right now, though. I know people want to go to lunch and stuff.
So basically, what are then the two takeaways? One takeaway is we need to make a decision whether or not the framework is interested in providing building blocks like shorted buffer in order for customers to build a PCI compliant solution. And we think we should think through what obsoleting secure string means for the stack, given that some APIs only work for secure string.
Yeah, and I wouldn't really focus on PCI compliance. I know that we've been talking about it for the past few minutes, but I was looking at it more from the perspective of marking individual call sites as like, hey, you're about to operate on potentially privileged data. Like, make sure you're being smart about it.
Yeah, some of the things like the GC clear on compaction feature came out of customer requests that involved PCI compliance, but that's just a 3-letter acronym that we can use for talking about the same concepts without getting into the legal ramifications of their exact rules. Yeah,
and the more we talk about it here, I think the more we realize that feature in and of itself would not be sufficient on its own.
Yeah.
We also need to talk about things like ASP.NET's allocator and so on.
Yeah, but because one of the things that we had brainstormed when that request came in is, GC dot this object is sensitive and then you give it an objref.
Yeah.
Well, great. If that was a string and you call substring on it, does the substring inherit that marker? If you call array.copy, does that inherit the marker? Like, it's like, oh God, effectively what we end up with is just saying everything is sensitive, and that's when we came up with clear on compact. So, and yeah, it's anything that uses pooling of any kind is potentially complicated. Yeah, like I said, the best way if you care about PCI compliance in .NET is it was encrypted the whole way through the .NET process. And honestly, the best way for PCI compliance is to dodge the pan altogether and use services such as, Square, I think, is one that has a good API. I'm not promoting them in any way, shape, or form or bad-mouthing them, but like, you just don't touch the credit card number. Let somebody else who has a lot of lawyers and code auditors deal with it for you.
Yeah, and I would want somebody to be able to write such a service on .NET. I don't know what they're written on today, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, but it is hard. Like the PCI DSS spec, I think, is over 700 pages. Some of them are about physically securing your hardware. Others are about clearing your memory. It's a hard thing, and yeah, we definitely would not be pursuing a statement that, if you use .NET, then you are 100% always guaranteed to be PCI compliant, because we can't do that. The endeavor here would partially be, where are the places that we've made it hard, and can we make it easier? So this is easier and not free, is, I think, what we would be aiming for in a replacement for some of Secure String's features. Where again, Secure String wasn't even providing them. People just thought they were.
Okay, so then I'll mark this as needs work. I'll paste in the notes I just took, and then you can take a look whether you agree with me. But Levi, I think so.
And the design doc does talk about a lot of the things we just mentioned as well.
Yeah, I think the doc is great. I haven't read it in great detail. I've read the introduction, to be honest, but I think we should push harder on this. I like the idea of us cleaning up the house a little bit more and being more specific about what it is that we, as a framework, want to provide and what we don't want to provide. Drawing that boundary, I think, is very useful. And that is also going into the, let's just touch types, even if it's a touchy area. No pun intended.
Yeah. And this seems like a reasonable high-level summary of what we concluded.
Yep. Works for me.
Alrighty, then this is it for today, and then I see you guys on I think Thursday, right?
Awesome. I'm going to write a small comment after what you did, just saying that we don't always have to have a replacement for everything. Sometimes docking, please don't do this, is good enough.
Yeah, it's
Because
also
that's so well before.
Indeed, but if we look at some of the features that people think Secure String offers, and we write down it doesn't do them, we still can't offer them. Don't expect we're going to solve this problem. Then that's.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at this is obsolescence is basically a means to actually promote that guidance, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes the purpose of obsolescence is to point people towards the replacement tech, and sometimes it's just telling people like, the thing you're using is not doing what you think it does, and stop doing it, right? Like they are not mutually exclusive, and I think sometimes obsoleting with don't hold it this way is the only thing you can do, because you can't just build the thing that you thought you can build.
Yeah.
All right, then, see you guys later.
Alrighty.
Bye, gents.
Bye-bye.
Zane.